All right, welcome back to another episode of Investigating Pathways. Today I'm joined by Hooman, who has co-founded AddThis, Expa, and most recently Collective. Hooman, thanks so much for taking the time.
Hey, great to meet you.
Absolutely. So I want to start off talking about your origin story. So can you tell me a little bit about your life as a kid, starting out until you went to college?
Yeah, so my family were Persian, so we left Iran, my parents, during the revolution. So in 1979, I was born along the way. So I'm actually British. I was born in London, and then when I was very young, we moved to the States. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, on West Pennsylvania side, so in Pittsburgh, if you're familiar, and
Mhm.
went to school all in Pennsylvania. So for undergrad and grad, was there as well. So big chunk of my life was there.
Gotcha. So I know one of the first things you did out of college was obviously co-found AddThis, right? And so I'm curious, right out of college, what was the thing that got you taking the risk of building your own company and getting you to take the plunge of being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so actually, it was interesting. So if you look back historically, so I was an undergrad at Penn. When I
Mhm.
finished, I was studying computer science and economics, and the dot-com was really instrumental for us. So you got to see people who were coders, engineers, creatives, building companies at a very young age, and it was pretty seminal moment for me because coming from a family who had immigrated, a lot of emphasis was put on your profession, and it was very traditional, work your way up, but I didn't really have this opportunity, if you will, presented to me that one could start a company when they're younger. So it was
Yeah.
it was a pretty formative time for me. Now, at the end of college, the dot-com bubble burst. Everyone was out of tech. There were no jobs, and I ended up going to grad school at Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon was where I met my co-founder, and I started to, you know, ideate, if you will, how I would take advantage of that opportunity to start a company. It had just been something that I was intrigued by for a number of reasons.
Gotcha. So I'm curious, what was the opinion of those around you? Like your parents, who you mentioned came from the revolution, what was their opinion as you sort of took the plunge to be an entrepreneur?
My parents were generally pretty supportive. I think once I had gone down the path of going into engineering, my parents are both physicians,
Yeah.
and they didn't have as much insight as to what the career path looked like.
Yeah.
And so I think they generally just encouraged me to think through it. And both of them had their own practices and were really, business owners in their own. So I think they were pretty supportive for the most part. I think, definitely it's some healthy fear, but I didn't get too much pushback.
Valid. So for Add This, I'm curious, where'd the idea for the platform sort of come from? Like, was it a problem you had personally encountered? Was it something you had heard of from others? Sort of where'd the concept come from?
So in grad school, I had gone to grad school actually wanting to study networking. So when you look at the history in the dot com, there was a couple of different things that happened. It was, all of the movement towards the web, but there was a lot of innovation in high speed networking. Telco was a big category. Lots of companies were going big and going public in that particular space. And I'd been a huge movie buff, and I still am. And I was frustrated because I'd gone to Blockbuster and God, I'm dating myself, but like you had to rent videotapes. It sucked, right? And then DVDs,
I'm gonna be
and you'd
honest,
have
I'm
late
gonna make you
fees.
feel so bad. I don't even know what these things are.
That's great.
Um,
That's great. So yeah, you had to rent things, right? And so you'd go rent your tape and you come home and you watch it, and it just sucked. And so when I was an undergrad, we had high speed networking, and
uh-huh.
so we started. Napster had come out, and a bunch of these different tools where you could just like watch content on your computer and it was free. Now it was pirated, but it was the beginning of us having the user experience and understanding what it could be like, where it's like, hey, we're on a device, it's connected to a high speed network, and we can just like watch whatever we want or listen to whatever we want from a computing device, which set the tone for like the next 20 years. And I thought to myself, like, why the hell do I have to go rent this? Like, go to this, like, I have to physically drive to this place to get this physical tape where the thing's stored, put this in a device and like do this and then rewind it and give it back to them. This is the most ridiculous thing ever. And so I wanted to do a video on demand startup actually. I had seen this other company, Netflix, and Netflix
Mhm.
at the time was sending like, it was a DVD subscription service. So you
Yeah.
would like literally go and get DVDs and you'd have this, you know, it's a little bit better in some ways because like they'd send it to you, you'd watch it, and then you had to like pump it back in the labeled thing and put in your mailbox, but not like this huge step function better. And so anyway, long story short, I wanted to build that. So we started building that. I wanted to start a company around it. When the dot com failed, we just gave up on the idea. There was no way we were going to start a company. We ended up using it for our senior project. But
Uh-huh.
that kind of gave me the area that I applied for grad school, which was networking. I thought, okay, well, I can
Yeah.
do something in video there. When I got to grad school and I started studying networking, I was fascinated by it, but there's a lot of math, stochastic processes. I loved the concept of it, but I found that I was more intrigued by how you can apply network theory at the application level, right? So how you can make social applications, how you can use a social graph there. And so I kind of went up the stack, started studying that. My master's thesis was actually how you apply, that type of math. So like they call it graph theory,
Hmm.
and you can model social systems. So it was, I think when I was in grad school, LinkedIn came out and Friendster. Like those were the two that were like, and Orchid. I think those were the three that was like the ones that were kind of the beginnings. LinkedIn obviously became massive, and so that's kind of where I started. Now my office mate, he was researching how the web would move from like a publishing platform to platform for developers to develop web services.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, it was the web at the time was like very read centric. It was effectively what was happening was people were putting up like magazines, like you'd surf the web, you go to websites, you click around, but it wasn't very interactive. And for sure, you could, like a developer couldn't just go like, oh, I'm going to go build an application off of Google Maps. I'm going to go build an application off of this. APIs were not a thing. That didn't start happening till, yeah, I would say like 2004, five, and then up there was the huge revolution there when REST was introduced
Yeah.
as a way of like how developer APIs could be put out. And so my optimist was researching that. That was a research topic, like when we were in school, like how will that be there? So we kind of combined those two concepts, this idea that the social web was going to be big, that the social graph could be a core web service, and the fact that the platform, the web itself was going to be a programming platform. And so we started playing with concepts around that. And that was really where AddThis came from.
Gotcha. So along that journey, was there sort of a specific point in time where you were like, you know what, we don't need to be worrying about add this not working or it failing? Like, what was that sort of validation that you think was key along your journey that motivated you to keep going?
There was not a single moment in the history of
Hmm.
the company that I was not worried until we sold.
Okay,
There,
that's
were-
fair.
uh, and I say that just because you know there's these different points in value creation as you're building a company. So the classic, now I think they've become dimensionalized and there's labels for them. But like you think about product market fit, right? So this concept that you've gotten enough traction and you can empirically tell if this product is accepted by the
Yeah.
marketplace. Then you have like you're scaling. So you take this product out to more people and a more audience, right? And then there's a bunch of things that go after that. But those are like two big chunky things to think about. But you have all of these problems along the way, right? So for example, we had strong product market fit in 2007, 2008 for our free product. It was growing virally. It was
And was
great.
it called product market fit then? Like, was the term product market fit generally used like it is these days? No.
No, that came a little bit later. I want to say like that was like post 2010 was when
Okay.
I started hearing that term become much more implemented. And so we had that, but we didn't have the monetization around it yet. We said the early monetization, and then the bottom fell out. We had the recession in 2008, right? And
Yeah.
it was a terrible time. I'd fired so many of my friends. I was 27 years old. I had no idea how to do that. And so, okay, now I'm worried about the life of the company. So we get out of that, we start monetizing, then you start having other problems, right? So it's never like a done picture. I think there are moments where you feel safer about the value you've created, and it's not as much like a zero, right?
Yeah.
So you're like, I've created enough that there's some win here, but the stakes just keep going out. When you have a venture backed company and it's every time you take more money, the bar goes up. And
Yeah.
so
Because you
you've seen
expect to
that
return
play
more
out
of
in the
that
market.
money, right?
Exactly. And so now you see that playing out in this market where, this year we're finally seeing some correction. And so a lot of that correction is being hit on the people that you would think were the safest, quote unquote, right? Like, so
Yeah.
typically, your question, when you look at it, think about all these people that are pre-IPO or IPO'd, right? That would be where you're quote unquote safe, but they're laying off people left and right,
Hmm.
right? So like, are you done if you're the founder? Like, are you done if you're the CEO? No, actually, it's like your company's in jeopardy. Look at Peloton. It was like a darling of the
Yeah.
industry. Look how
And then
far
just
it's
tanked.
falling on valuation. Yeah, exactly. Is that so? You can never. There's a book by Andy Grove, who was one of the seminal like big Intel execs called "Only the Paranoid Survive." Like you
Hmm.
always have to keep reinventing yourself. You always have to stay in the market, and you always have to be vigilant because the market changes. Like the success of yesterday is what causes the failure of tomorrow.
That's fair. So I want to go back to what you mentioned was the recession time, right? What was that experience like for you? You said you were 27, had to lay off a bunch of your friends. How did you sort of keep going after that? I assume it was an incredibly hard experience. How did the product pivot? You mentioned monetization. How'd you go about that whole, how'd you navigate that whole scheme?
Yeah, so I actually spoke about this recently at the Collision conference. If you're familiar, it's a big conference that they have every year for tech.
Hmm.
And I thought a lot about this. I think there's a lot of different principles that guide you when you're now, and that I would advise a lot of people to think through. But first and foremost, like our core value is people first, and that's my core value, the first core value collective, which is the company I'm at now. And I think that dedication to that is tested when you have to say goodbye to people, right? So what do you
Yeah.
do if the only thing to save the company is to say goodbye to some people? How do you treat them well, and then how do you treat the people that are behind well? So that was really difficult to navigate, and a lot of it was making sure that first and foremost the people that were leaving were treated with dignity and respect, and they're still friends. I mean, we're all, so many of them, we're still all close and we talk, and it's hard to do that. And then also I think that gave me personally some fuel, and I hope the team that stayed to say, look, like we got to lay it out on the field. All of
Yeah.
these people like who couldn't join us the rest of it, like we need to finish this off for them. And so, on a personal basis, I kept a list of all the folks that were, that departed, and I looked at it every morning, basically when I went to work.
So that
So
was
before I
your
would,
fuel.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I was exhausted. I didn't. We were lucky in the sense of the team stayed together, and we cracked a lot of codes during that period. We actually ended up having more cash, our revenue 10x. The company was in a much better position out 3 years after that, but it wasn't free, right? Like those
Yeah.
people, they weren't with us. That was a huge cost. On a personal level, I had a huge cost. I gained like 40 pounds. I had an ulcer. Like my health was a mess. And so um, I learned a lot there about things I did right and things I did wrong that, I'm happy to share. But yeah, it was a challenging time.
Gotcha. So now I want to hop back to how you mentioned the sort of process of venture was for you, right? So obviously you all raised a bunch of venture capital over the years until you sold. And so as a first-time founder, relatively young out of college, what was that experience like for you? How'd you go about navigating and cracking raising venture capital?
You know, it's changed a lot. So
Hmm.
you have to look at the time. So the amount of venture capital, if you look at, I think it's almost 5x from 2010 to 2020, and I started in 2006 raising.
Yeah.
And so it was much more supply constricted and so the cost of capital was higher, the terms were more strict, and it was similar to today in some respect, but it's become a little bit easier because
Well, yeah, today
there's,
money is like just almost floating around, right? There's
well,
just
I
so
would
many
say it
folks with
was
money.
until last year. Yeah, this
Yeah.
this year I think that's changing, but like generally speaking, it's still easier than it was. I mean, there's more capital I mean, if you look at when I was racing, for sure, it doesn't. I mean, you can't compare it. The terms and everything else, you can't compare it. So I'd say the first thing was always surrounding myself with people who had more experience, and talking to people that are experts. So, for example, when we started our first company, my network was limited, right? I'm from Pittsburgh. My parents are immigrants, and I don't know what I'm doing. So, the first natural network was to find the people in graduate school who had connections to the entrepreneurial
Yeah.
community, who either it's to founders or to people at venture capital, and learn. So I would just like be relentless, meeting people, trying to get to know them. Every time I met someone, I'm like, okay, who are other people to talk to, and build out the network. And that's how I got connected to people through the Valley, right? So like the dean of Carnegie Mellon, or like some of our advisors, would connect us with folks, and that was instrumental. But you just have to be relentless in building that network, and people are really good about connecting, and that's part of the reason, honestly, I do this now. Or like, you reached out, I don't know what you thought the probability of success was going to be, but um, I think people want to help other people move forward in their career and want to be of service to them in the tech community. And that was something that really appealed to me about Silicon Valley. And so
Hmm.
that's what I did. And I did it for a long, long time, the last 20 years almost.
Gotcha. So I know a little bit down the road in 2016, about 10 years almost exactly from when you started the company was obviously acquired for a couple hundred million by Oracle, right? So can you tell me a little bit about, even though you had sort of shifted away from a day-to-day CEO role to, I believe, chairman of the board role at the time, what was that experience like for you, right? Your first company getting acquired like that.
It was interesting. So obviously there was a large part of me that was very happy. So as the chairman of the company, I was very happy with the outcome. Why? It was all cash. It was a nice offer. The company landed in a place where it was useful, and my team who was there did well. So that, and our investors. So if you look at all the stakeholders, everyone
Hmm.
did well, right? Our customers continued to be served. Our investors made money. Our team made money. So as a chairman, I felt good. I think as a founder, I felt a little bit like we stopped short, a
Yeah.
little. If being like emotionally honest, like you want to go all the way. I know now that there's no all the way, right? So it's all relative. So what is it? You want to stop at 1 billion? You want to stop at 5? You want to stop at 10? There's
Yeah,
always
you can just keep
someone
going
that,
and going and going.
yeah, in theory you could. And part of that was just learning, me learning about there are natural stopping points, and you have to really have some maturity and insight as to like when this journey needs to stop. And it's difficult. You don't often know in hindsight. I'm really now happy that I stopped. Well, in partnership with our investors, we decided to sell when we did for a number of reasons. But at that time, I felt a bit of loss, I think, and because I'd hoped we would continue.
Gotcha. So I want to rewind a little bit and talk about when you shifted to being the chairman. I know you started also investing via your own
One
personal
moment.
fund. So can you tell me a little bit about sort of what got you wanting to open your own fund?
Yeah, so I think, for me, it started with learning.
Hmm.
I just wanted to understand it better, and that's a way. I mean, I'm an engineer by background and creative, so I've been playing guitar since I was like 16. I've been drawing since
Oh,
I
me
was like
too.
5. I've coded since I was 12. So I learned by doing, and I really wanted to understand the other side of the table. Obviously, I think there's like a really great potential outcome. You can make money, but candidly, the probability of success is quite low. And at the amounts of capital that you put in at the very beginning, you're almost statistically likely to fail, right? You have to
Yeah.
keep deploying for a long time,
In
right?
order to
So
make
if you're
some
not,
level of return, right? Not even a huge
yeah,
amount of return, just any return.
yeah, on average, right? So there's
Hmm.
always outliers. Like I know people that have done 2 investments and they made $1 gajillion, right? I know people that made 20 and they made nothing.
Yeah.
So you have to build a pretty large portfolio over a couple of vintages to really understand the mechanics. But I thought it was a way to stay involved, also to learn about other businesses. So I use that as a mechanic, and that was the original impetus for it. And I'd had the opportunity, thanks to my board, to do some secondary, which is, for those who don't know, you sell a bit of your private stock on
Hmm.
the private market. And so I'd had some money while AddThis was still going. So I got to realize some gains while I still had some private holdings, and so I had to put the money to work. And so that was where I just started, and it was a really great experience. I got to learn to invest in using different vehicles, like how the sheets work. I had to make decisions. I had to start thinking in a different way than I had thought before. And I mean, I still tremendously enjoy it. I still actively invest, but you get a lot out of it as an entrepreneur. Honestly, it's been really helpful to me.
Gotcha. So I'm curious, what was sort of your investment philosophy? Obviously, you invest in like what Uber, SpaceX, Stripe, a couple of these huge companies, right? Pretty early on. And so what sort of drew you to these investments? What do you sort of look at in a company when you're investing?
Yeah. So for me, I think, and look, I've been going. I've tried to most of my career. I've invested very very early, just because
Hmm.
it's what I understand, what I'm good at, and then I try to. I've learned where I want to play more and more, and again, part of it is learning by doing. I've done some stuff again outside of that, so I'll invest in things as they get larger and larger and larger, or double down on them as they get larger, because I understand like how that works.
Yeah.
Like, how do I evaluate that? How does that work? What if I want to buy secondary from someone? Like the reverse of what happened to me. How does that work? So I've done that several times. And I think my general philosophy is, first and foremost, you have to focus on the people. It's the same thing that I had in my companies. Like, who's running it? Why are they running it? Right? Because especially early on, when you look at, there's a lot of non-linearity and non-determinism in a startup, right? So they'll pick a direction. Maybe it's the right market, but it's the wrong thesis. It's the wrong go-to-market. There's more thing probabilistically. There's more things that'll be wrong than right. Okay, so then the only variable that you can control for is this person. Does this person have a fast learning curve? Do they have hustle, the strength? And I generally, from like a philosophy perspective, over index on that, especially when you're pre-seed seed. Like there's
Yeah.
nothing more important.
Because you don't know what the
Second,
company is doing, whether they're going to pivot, so you just go
I
for
mean,
the first one.
they and look, people have become much better. Like the decks you'll see for pre-seed and seed now are 10x what they were 10 years ago, but there's also more
Hmm.
material. People have learned how that works. They understand like the financing process. And a lot of this has become open sourced and community knowledge, right? Like YC published their safe. I think that changed the
Yeah,
game for everything, right? Because now people start copying that and like using the standard term sheet. Like it just changes everything, right? You don't have all the legal fees. Everything became faster. And so I would say that's the first. Second, I would look at the market, especially again early on. Like, is it a big market? What are the incumbents like? Where's the state of the technology? And then I would look at the problem and the problem they're trying to solve within that market and the solution, but more from the lens of how did they articulate this, like that solution? What was the thought process with it? Is there something, you know, an insight that they had, and like sometimes very contrarian insight, both on the product and also the resulting go to market. Why is that important? Because hopefully it works, right?
hmm,
But more importantly, that tells me how they think, and if they're wrong, or how are they going to solve the problem? So I want to almost understand the driver and motivation for that as much as I want to understand the solution itself
yeah,
in those early stages. As it gets bigger, you start weighing different criteria because now you have historical trend. And I'm not suggesting that people matter less. They actually, in some cases, matter much, much more. But then you can start looking at the mechanics of the business, unit economics, go to market,
you got
depending
more
on how
data
much.
essentially.
Yeah, because and then of course your return is going to be less and less and less because more and more is proven, right? I look at like a business as a bunch of if statements, and the more if statements that they solve, the more valuable the business from like a
Yeah,
programming perspective. Once you go public, if everyone knows how your business runs, there's not a bunch of upside there the way that there once was because you're not taking any bets.
exactly. Because
Solve
you know
problem.
that the company's going to do well, probably, right? If you're investing in Apple right now, you know that money's
And
just going to stay there.
in theory, right? But like there's
Yeah,
less risk, right? That's the theory. Obviously, some of these great companies, if you take the Warren Buffett school of thought after, again, it's all relative, right? You can still make amazing return, right? If you would have invested in 2010 in the cloud indexes and in particular in consumer, you would have 10x your money,
hmm,
right? So if you look at some of the best returns actually ever. They were on like IPO'd companies. Like you look at Salesforce, you look at Google, you look at Amazon. If you would have invested then, now Amazon was weird because there's a little bit of like aberration because it went up during dot-com and went
yeah,
down. But like even if you normalize for that, you still would have made a shitload of money post IPO. And so a lot of these companies, once the platforms and networks take effect, a lot of the value is post after the billion or 10 billion because now
yeah,
they're taking the market, they're realizing the thesis, right? And so the startup investors actually, the public investor can do as well as the startup investor in those cases. It's pretty awesome. So, but you evaluate that with a different lens. It's much more fundamental and like I would
yeah.
say more like Warren Buffett, and it's a different story.
Fair. So I think that provides a nice segue into talking about the next thing you sort of worked on hands-on, which is Expa, right? Which I know you're one of the founding partners. And so obviously with your own personal fund, you had gotten your feet wet with venture capital, but sort of what got you back into starting your own venture fund along with the others who you worked with, as opposed to, going back into entrepreneurship or something along those lines.
So, like everything for me, it starts with the people. And one of the great artifacts of my first run, so AddThis was, a marketing automation platform at the core. We were trying to drive traffic and engagement for these advertising publishers. And our free tools were for the people like the web channel, right? So they could install these embedded services or plugins, right? While we were building that, there was a lot of ecosystems emerging that we had to cooperate with, right? So one of those ecosystems was social because we're connecting to social
Hmm.
networks. So there's 300 social networks vying for consumer attention. Programmatic advertising came up. So when we had a free product that was like these plugins, we had a premium product, and then we actually had APIs to let people directly access data because we tracked 2 billion users, right? So I was in the intersection of like these like massive sea changes, which was like programmatic advertising, which now is like the dominant way that people are targeted, and social networking, which is again huge. So the cash itself was good, but the learning and the network was actually pretty big, seminal. So Garrett had started Stumble Upon at the time, my friend, and so I connected with him through that and a bunch of the other social networking folks. When I moved to the Valley from the East Coast, I reconnected with a bunch of them, and he had he'd just started Uber, but he was, thinking to himself his role And the ecosystem was more around starting more Ubers versus being the operator. So TK and all those guys ran Uber and obviously had a lot of success, but he wanted to build something, almost. There was a lot of different ideas at Exchange, but one of them that intrigued me was like, we want to be the partners that we didn't have.
Hmm.
So when you look at the group that we were in, like our cohort, a lot of the venture capitalists were bankers, or they came up through like very classic upbringings. I went to a good school. I was a banker. I worked for 3 years, and I'm an associate. And then I came up. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Like I think there's a lot of animus towards that type of profile. A lot of venture capitalists still have that profile, but for seed and early stage, what would have been helpful and what we wanted to aspire to is like, what if you had a technical product founder who was actually an operator who could help you,
Yeah.
who understood that ecosystem and knew how to speak to those people and was connected to those people? What
A
would
lot
you be
more
able to do
hands-on,
then?
pretty much, right? Like you've done the
Exactly.
work yourself.
Exactly. And so that was, what Garrett was thinking about, and that intrigued me. And so, that was very organic. I was hanging out there. He was like, hey, why don't you hang out and help me? And either if you want to build a company, maybe we could do it together. If you want to work with me on Expa, we could do that. It was very open ended, and I got to know him and some of the other folks there. My current partner Roberto, Naveen, who had started Foursquare, and it was very early. It was like there's nothing really there yet in terms of like infrastructure, and we had a lot of work to do. And fast forward, here we are. So we're on fund 3, and I ended up leading most of our venture investments before I left, or I should say, transitioned to a different role. And it was a fantastic experience. Got to work with great companies like Convoy and Fabric and Prometheus and Sleeper, and it's been really awesome. So that's how we got into it. It was pretty organic. But I think the takeaway there is you just always want to, you should always be investing in relationships, and you always want to keep around people, because look, that's all it is, right? Like that's the path you navigate, right? That's the great social network. And so I think people who underestimate the value of these relationships are missing the big picture.
That's dope. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I want to sort of move away from Expa real quick and start talking about Collective now, right? Which is where you're most recently at. And so, for starters, what got you to sort of move away from a more hands-on role at Expa and go back into entrepreneurship with Collective?
So I love investing. As I mentioned, I've been now doing it for, God, I don't even know, over 10 years. And I enjoy it tremendously, right? So one of the things that I learned at Expo about myself that is both a competency and a passion is I love to be a founder, helping founders, right? It's been great. Helping them avoid things that I had made mistakes in, learning with them about new ways to crack codes. It's amazing, right? It's just, you learn while you make money. Like, how great is that? But for me, I also missed being a founder of an operating company, working with a team day to day, scaling, working with customers. And so that got me thinking about, okay, is there a more scalable way to be a founder, helping founders? And I thought, everyone wants to help venture back founders.
Yeah.
Everyone. Like, it's much easier to get, if I want to go talk to a VC or I want to talk to a company, it's much easier for me to get from them than, say, for example, the smaller founders. So the majority of these founders, it turns out, are small. And in fact, they're very, very small. We call them businesses of one in our parlance at Collective. So
So freelancers, right?
freelancers,
Yeah.
like some of them are gig workers. People are consultants. You have people who are professionals. Maybe you don't think of them as businesses. Like, I never thought of my parents as businesses. My mom ran her own business for 30 years. So did my dad. They're businesses, but they're psychiatrists. I didn't think of them as a business,
Mhm.
or like a lawyer or whatever, right? Like they're a business, they're an entity, even though it's one person and so who's going to help them, right? And so I start getting fascinated with this idea of that community and helping them. And then I met my co-founder through a friend. He actually came and pitched us a similar concept that we were thinking about incubating. And it's funny, and him and I joke around this, but I told him, like, this is going to be like the best meeting or the worst meeting, because I want to really build this.
Mhm.
Good news is we have capital, and we're just getting started on incubating, this concept. And so bad news is, if like we don't want to work together, I guess we'll meet in the field, right? So, and we had a great conversation, and we became friends, and we spent weeks just talking about values, talking about how we would want to do this together, and that was how Collective was born.
Gotcha. So I'd assume with COVID becoming a thing right around the time that you were planning to launch and were already building the company, right? And a lot of folks either getting laid off, quitting their jobs, just with the whole atmosphere, a lot more small businesses, as you call them, businesses for one, were created. And did that pandemic have any impact on the way you sort of went around building the company? Did it lead to any meaningful changes? Or was it just like an accelerant? Did it just pour more fuel on the fire? How did that end up going down?
I mean, the pandemic was so transformative for us in so many ways. First, like all the companies, we had to go remote,
Hmm.
right? And we had no intention of doing it. And if I'm being intellectually honest, I really didn't want to for a long time
Yeah.
because I firmly believe that building culture was easier in a physical co-located space. I still contend that it's probably easier. Like there's a lot more tools when you're in person. Um, but we had to do that. That was just huge. Um, I would say second, we became obviously more conservative during that year. It was very uncertain. No one knew what was
Yeah.
going on. We were lucky because we're starting. When you're starting from zero, you don't cut, right? So we were just grew more conservatively, and that was interesting. Um, and of course, like the tailwind that we had was what ends up happening. And again, this is like an abstraction, so averages are dangerous. But on average, when you look across these ecosystems, if you're a company, all things being equal, when there's uncertainty, what you do is you have problems and solutions that need to be implemented, right? So what do? You
Hmm.
get labor.
Yeah.
So you have two options. You can either hire full-time or you hire contingent labor via contract. So if you have higher uncertainty on your future, you tend to hire more contingent labor because you're mitigating your risk. And
Yeah.
so that's what ends up happening. So it was net good for us because the population boomed. That's what happened in 2008, by the way. It booms. And so that's kind of, what we that for us it was, I think, net positive in the sense of we had to build a muscle. We needed to build a remote muscle anyway. It's the nature of our
Hmm.
company, but we had to do it earlier, and it really forced us to build that skill set. And I think our market grew, but obviously, would have loved to not have to go through that. It would have been nice.
Yeah. So speaking of the remote versus in-person thing, is the company now like fully remote, or are y'all sort of doing a hybrid thing back in person? What is that like for you?
Well, we never, it's funny. I have had investors ask me if I'm going back to the office. The reality is we've never rented an office before.
Oh,
We
the company's
started
just never had an office registered to it.
no, no.
Oh.
We incubated the company inside of Expa's offices, and we were co-load in there at the beginning, and then the pandemic hit.
Hmm.
So luckily, because of, I'm still a venture partner at Expa, and because Expa is very founder first, and has created space for founders. Like we can use it when we need it, but we've been completely remote. And so for us, the question is not do we go back to the office? The question is there's a tool that's back in the tool chest called physical
Yeah.
space and physical community. How are you going to use that tool now that you can do it? So the analogy that I use to give people kind of the way I think about this is if I told you you had to start a company and you could only operate on the phone, that's pretty limiting, right?
Yeah.
You're literally only allowed to do calls. What if I told you could only use text? That's limiting, right? We have all these channels, and now we're on Zoom, right? We've never met. You literally reached out to me on email. We arranged it. Now we're on Zoom and we're collaborating and we're creating like value for this ecosystem. That's freaking awesome, right?
Yeah.
And so that's great. But being in a room when you're with a bunch of engineer product designers and whiteboarding or building relationships and going out and having drinks, that's also awesome. So any tool, like getting on a plane and going and seeing someone, like having that meeting, that can be awesome. Anything when done in excess isn't the right application of a tool, right?
Yeah.
And so we just have to think about that. I don't have the answer yet, but we are thinking pretty seriously about how we combine like meetups with potentially centers of excellence, right? So if there's
So
areas where we're going
continuing
to
the
have
networking stuff, making sure everyone in the company is building their own networks within the company.
correct, correct, yeah. And we had a kickoff, for our fiscal year ends June 30th. We had a kickoff in July, and it was phenomenal. I mean, people's energy levels were higher. They left on a high. So what that showed me was don't underestimate the power of in-person communication and collaboration. It is immeasurable. We don't even know how to measure the difference between that and remote right now. But again, I'm not saying remote's not good. It's a tool, right? And I'm not saying Zoom isn't good or phone calls or Slack. These are gifts. We just don't, if you have too much of any food, for example, you're going to get sick, right? You
Yeah.
drink too much water, you're going to die. But if you don't drink enough, you're going to die too. So we have to
So you have
figure
to
it
find
out.
the middle ground.
Yeah, you have to find what the balance point is for your particular company. And every company is different. Like you could HashiCorp. HashiCorp went public. It's a dev tools company. WordPress. They've like Matt and those guys have done a great job. They defined the remote work experience for many people, right? They did the roadmap. It worked for them, but it might not work for other companies as well. Like if you're trying to build the next Facebook, could you do it? Maybe. Like we'll see with the decentralized stuff, but like some of the innovation that occurred, some of that early like
It was
ahas, they were
integral to
because
be in person.
at that time.
Yeah.
So then the question is, can you do it again? And you have to be careful. Like you never want to be too extreme. If you think you can't do it, you might get scooped by someone who can do it. Like I believe strongly, like in social, for example, like we're about to have a huge wave come up, like a huge disruption for a number of reasons. And so maybe it will be distributed, you know, because
Yeah,
we'll see.
that's valid. So now I sort of want to step away from the day-to-day sort of chronological order that we followed and just sort of think big picture for the last question that I have for you, which is just what is like one thing that you wish you had known when you were first starting out with any of the companies, with the venture fund at Expa, just like sort of one, I guess, core learning lesson, to be cliche.
What was the number one lesson? I think it remains with the theme that I keep going on. It's you know, you have to have a radical focus on your people, right? Who are you bringing in? Who stays, who goes, who's around the table, and that culture that you're building. Because the founder and CEO's job in particular is not to build the product. Like maybe it is in day zero because you don't have staff, but that's actually not the artifact you're leaving behind. The artifact is the company. And the company is the engine that builds products. So you have to build like the business OS and all of the groups around that. And the lingua franca, the way that people communicate is culture. And so if you don't curate the people and you don't help them accelerate and make it an environment where the best people can grow and the people that can't hang, you know, can't hang, right? Like as any like sports program. But you have to do that with the people first attitude. Like how do you tell someone that killed themselves to work for you that they're not going to make the team? You know, that is where you have to spend the most time, I think, because if you have like a person who's tough to work with will take up 10x time than a person that's like killing it, right? So they'll suck you dry, and they don't mean to often, but that's the reality of it is. You know, like Steve Jobs, to paraphrase, had this thing where like if you have a person who's excellent, they don't need to be managed. They're self-motivated. You shouldn't have to motivate your team. That's not your job. If someone's not self-motivated, they are not going to be motivated, period, full stop. Your job is to take motivated, successful people and give them room to grow as fast as possible because they will kill it if you do that. They know what to do. You give them the direction. You have to provide clear direction to them and the resources. That is what you're supposed to do. So I'd say that's probably like the number one. And then number two would be do so much less slower, right? So I think there's like especially with product-oriented, technology-oriented founders, like people think one more feature, one more product, one more, like it almost is like, it's like a cancer, right? But you want to stay razor focused for a longer period than you think. Like you look at Netflix, when they hit streaming, they got it right. They just did streaming and they kept going and going and going and going and going, almost to a point of like mania, right? But you need to make sure that you're razor sharp on something, because if you diffuse focus and you don't say no, like you're just going to end up doing three things really poorly. And it's hard to decide, to figure out when you're going to do that, but saying no is really important. And it goes back to the people, right? Because great people can do a lot, but if you take a really great person, you tell them to do three things shittily, like they're going to leave, right? They want to do one thing well. So
that's fair. Okay. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think that brings us to a really nice sort of educational close for what it's worth. So yeah, thanks so much again, Hooman, for taking the time to talk with me and coming on the podcast today.
No, it's amazing. Appreciate it, and best of luck, and stay in touch.